Kevin Elmy. In this presentation, we're going to talk about soil integration into a cropping system in regards to soil health. So in soil health, I work with five main principles. Number one is having a living root of a plant in the vegetative stage growing for as many days as we can throughout that growing season. Number two is reducing the amount of tillage we do. Number three is reducing synthetics, which with organic is quite easy. Number four is increasing the plant diversity within a rotation. And number five is the livestock integration. So when we are incorporating livestock, in the big picture, it isn't really important to have livestock in our management system, but it does allow that soil to build and heal dramatically quicker than without. Our soils were built in in all of the agricultural areas. Our soils were built with livestock and wildlife through many centuries of evolution of our soils. So it just makes sense that if we can find some way to get the livestock back into our management, it just makes sense that our soils are just going to be better if managed properly. With today's modern agriculture management, with the overtillage, overgrazing, loss of plant diversity, reduction of soil microbes, and loss of soil carbon and organic matter, this picture on the right, you can see how platy it is. In this field, I was jumping on a shovel trying to get the shovel into the ground. It was this in this case, it was dirt. It was not soil. There was no life in it. It was really nasty. So we need to change our management. Otherwise, this is what's going to be happening to our soils. So one of the tools by getting the livestock integration in is the use of cover cropping. The cover crops will allow more livestock impact on our land because we're going to have more opportunities for cows to be out there grazing, or bison or sheep or horses, whatever we decide to use. So some of the different types of cover crops we can use. First one is the relay cover crop. And the relay cover crop is going to have your main cash crop, and then underneath it, whether it's the same time or after the seeding of your cash crop, you're going to seed something that is going to be underneath the canopy of that cash crop. You'll harvest it. Then this relay cover crop will continue growing into the fall and into the winter. So that's a relay cover crop. So it's like a relay race. Intercropping is growing two cash crops together. And so something like oats and peas, harvest that off, and then you separate it. But it also gives you another opportunity to get either a relay cover crop, or try more plants growing in the fall. Or we can do a full season cover crop. So with the intention of replacing a summer follow application, or something that in rotation doesn't make you a lot of net dollars per acre, well, maybe replace with a full season cover crop. And we'll talk about whether we hay it, graze it, or how we manage it. The capture cover crop, or the post-harvest cover crop. This is where, if in the case of a captured cover crop, if you're doing a green manure, you're working that green manure into the ground, then you turn around, you seed something that is going to capture all those nutrients that the cover crop has brought up and being released in that soil. The post-harvest cover crop, very similar, where we would harvest our cash crop and then turn around and seed a cover crop after that, to have once again that green plant growing into the fall. Or the other option is including either short or long-term perennial forages in rotation. So whether it is as simple as having a biennial in, so it's in for 2 years, or we'd go a little more advanced and have something that's in for, say, 3 to 5 years, or have something in for 10 years, managed properly, it can do a lot of good fruit to a lot of soils. When we start looking at the livestock integration, you do not have to own the animals. For myself, I've never owned an animal, besides some cats and dogs, but they really don't count. But when we start looking at it, I am trained as an agronomist. I know how to grow things for plants. Neighbor down the road, he's a rancher. He knows how to raise animals. So in a lot of cases, those livestock producers tend to be a little short on feed, so they're looking always to, buy feed. So instead of the case in this case, what I'm doing is I'm seeding down some grazing land, so that this way I can have the animals that have the animal impact on my land without having to own the animals. So I supply the fence, the water, and the plants. They bring their animals over, so it works out really quite well for us. So we're working on each other's strengths. When we start looking at the custom grazing, the compensation is going to be determined on how much everybody has to do. So if the livestock owner has to put up the fence and has to haul water and has to, the more work, check on the animals, then compensation is going to have to reflect that. Whereas if in my case, the bison producer that I'm working with, he brings the animals over. He'll bring over a little bit of mineral that he wants into his animals, and then he picks them up close to spring. So it works out well for him, works out well for us. So it has to be a win-win, and that's whenever I'm doing my talks, if it isn't a win-win, it isn't going to work long term. When we start looking at this livestock integration part, we have to be looking at our goals. What are we trying to do? We have to look at short-term goals. We have to look at long-term goals. Where do we want to be in you know, in this time frame? What are we trying to do? What are our issues? Using this livestock integration is an awesome way to convert land from conventional into an organic system. Because we have that 3-year transitional, whole thought process with having that 3-year transition is, and once again, organic people tell me it's to detoxify that soil. There's some of that. The biggest thing, the whole thought process behind it, is it gives you time to build a favorable fungal to bacterial ratio. And if you listen to my weeds presentation, I talk about this fungal to bacteria ratio, and most of our agriculture soils are dominated by bacteria. So we have a low fungal to bacteria ratio. When we have a fungal to bacteria ratio under zero point 0.3, so that's zero point 0.3 pounds of fungi per pound of bacteria, when we're under that, this is where we have wild oats, this is where we have cleavers, this is where we have our early successional plants growing that we call weeds. Once we get over that zero point 0.3, those weeds disappear. So the whole thought process between the 3-year transitional period is to build this fungal to bacteria ratio, because when you go from conventional to organic, you lose some of the, in quotes, easy buttons to control weeds to using more cultural. And the more tillage we do, the more nitrates we have in the soil, the more bacteria we have in our soil, the more issues we have. So if we can have these livestock integration periods within our rotation, that's going to build that fungal or bacteria ratio. That's going to solve a lot of our agricultural issues that we have in our production. So when we have this livestock integration, there's a few ways of managing the the plants that we grow. So we can go in and we can harvest that plant production as hay or silage. So the positive there is it cleans up that land without doing a lot of tillage, because when your weeds get to that flowering stage, go out and cut it, roll them up in bales, and we've reduced that seed load going back into the ground. The negative is it exports nutrients from that soil. The carbon, when I listened to Jay Fear speak a couple of years ago, he went through the carbon budgets in plants growing. And the numbers that he was talking about was about 75% of the carbon that is above ground in plants is eventually lost to the air. So to go out and hay it, yeah, you're losing some carbon. The key in haying is leaving enough residue there to leave some soil armor. And so that may help compensate some of the losses that you have. And to have this perennial, okay, or short-term perennial, when we're getting into these hays and silage, we're reducing our tillage. So that's a big positive in my mind. Soil organic matter is built through soil exudates that feed microbes and the root mass that is left in the soil after you harvest it. So the more or the longer period of time we can have of plants growing, having those root exudates going into the soil feeding microbes, that is the quickest way to build soil organic matter. We can build organic matter from the top down quicker than we can from the bottom up. The geologist will say to build an inch of topsoil is going to take about between 1,000 and 2,000 years. When we build organic matter from the top, we can do it extremely quickly and very efficiently. So these are the things we want to look at when we want to start building soil. The trade-off of using the export model of just haying is going out and having a plan to go out and hay a piece and then turn around and graze that piece after. So it's going to be a compromise between straight hay and straight grazing. We can get the bales off, but after we get the bales off, then we have the animals turned out. Now we're getting that manure and urine back onto that soil, which is once again going to help stimulate and cycle these nutrients a lot more efficiently. If you want to go that next level, so the bales you took off that field, you just leave those in the field so that this way you have that secured feedstock and it's sitting in the field ready to graze. So you do modified bale grazing in there with the bales that you have. So this way you've got those so you can go out and count your bales. So you have 250 bales off of 100 acres. That's going to feed so many cows for so many days. Plus you're going to be grazing. So there's the economics of how to figure out the return on something like that. Ideally, the quickest bang for the buck to build soil with livestock is grazing. The grazing, if you do, the integrated management of the grazing animals out there, it will help manage your residue for future crops. It'll clean up unseeded acres so that fence rows, sloughs, some eroded areas will help clean those areas up. Very low cost relatively for feeding cows. The negative is it may be unevenly grazed depending on management. And that management part is when we look at grazing, do we want to rotationally graze it? Do we want to continuously graze it, which is the least effective way of grazing from the standpoint of effectiveness for soil building? We can do stockpile grazing, whether it's fall, winter, or spring. If you're interested in this and using livestock as a tool, Alan Savory has some wonderful books that you can read about how the holistic grazing model works and why it works. So that's a real good resource to get into if you want to get deeper into that. When we start looking at this grazing part, now the question is, do we want to add supplemental feed to our grazing area? it it gives you an opportunity to import more nutrients. It imports more carbon into that field, but it increased cost. That increased cost also increases the days in the field, so you're going to get more return out of it. So the real big dilemma is, what is that bale cost? How many pounds is it? So what's the cost per pound? What is the days of grazing you get out of it to realize a profit out of it? Those are the things we have to work on. Now, when we start looking at manure, so these cow plops out in the field, you know, part of that is this nutrient cycling. So we're taking a green or brown plant and making it turn to this color. A lot of the manure is quite rich, easy to for the soil microbes to digest, and this is where the microbes in the microbes the bacteria they kind of go crazy. It's a readable digestible food source, so the bacteria get in there, numbers increase, nutrient cycle quick, you get the good bang for the buck. Those cow plops are relatively dense with nutrients, so you're basically it's your NPKs plus your full micros. and it can feed your saprophytic microbes. So your saprophytic microbes are the microbes that help break down really tough carbon chains. So your lignins and things like that. So it helps develop more of a saprophytic microbe, which once again in the future is a good thing. And when you look at this manure, the reason why it's important, it's the soil and the rumen are very similar. So that what we're dealing with is a biotic system that is quite easily to throw it out of balance. That is why when we are looking at these cow plops, we need to be able to go and get a read of how those animals are doing. Do they have proper balance in their feed? When we start looking at animals, ruminant animals, there's two sensors in that rumen. One is for quality, one is for quantity. One of the stories I like to tell is when we started getting into hay production on our farm. We the guy that was doing the baling for us in the past, he would cut it and bale it, and it was an alfalfa brome stand, and he would let it get to full flower, knock it down, bale it up, take the bales home. So it was a win-win. I needed the haying done. He came over, he cut it, and he took it home, sent me a check. Everything was good. Then he was working off farm. He getting a little behind, so I said, you know what, it's time for me to buy a hay bind. So I bought a hay bind, and I went out and I cut the alfalfa when it was in that bud stage. Cut it, baled it. He took the bales home, and it was around year end in December. And he came to me and he said that the cows did not like my bales. I said, "Oh, tell me more." He said, "Well, when he put out the bales, when he cut it, the alfalfa was full bloom. The brome grass was relatively mature. The cows would eat all of the bales, and then he would have to put some chop out to make them happy. Whereas the stuff that we're cutting in the bud stage, the cows would eat three-quarters of it, and then they would go off and they would look for straw to eat. And they said, well, they don't like it. And then I explained to him the whole idea of these two sensors, so quality and quantity. When you're feeding relative feed value of, or the alfalfa brome that is fully mature or close to mature, your relative feed value would be in that 90 to 100 range as a quick number. When you're in the bud stage, we did feed tests and our relative feed value came back at 150. A beef cow needs about a relative feed value of 110 to 125 as a quick range. So the alfalfa that was mature was too low. And so that quality sensor did not go off. So the cows just kept eating. With the stuff that we cut and it was relative feed value of 150, it was too rich for them. They ate what they wanted, all they wanted of the high quality feed. That quality sensor went off. Then they went to look for roughage. This is as dumb as cows are. They are actually smarter than us, than what they know what they need to be eating. So when we can have that balance of they can eat all they want of the good stuff, then they go look for roughage, that rumen will be clicking on all cylinders and you're going to get good growth, good maintenance. Whenever you see a cow out in the pasture and her head is down on the ground and she's sniffing and moving her head back and forth and walking but not eating, she's hunting for something. And this is where in a pasture, if you have a, a bale that's high protein, high relative feed value, and then you have some straw bales out there, and the animals go to one of those bales and start eating those, they're eating that because they are balancing their ration. And then this is where, looking at the manure, you'll see it going from, you know, too runny or too hard to being what they call ideal cow patties. When we have too much fiber in our system, this is where we have those hockey pucks and it stacks up. When we have too little fiber, that's where, if Bessie has a cough, make sure you're looking at her eyes and not her tail, because it could get messy, that runny manure. So these are the things that we have to, it's a crappy job, but it's something that we have to go out and just pay attention to. So here's two examples of cow patties. The one on the left, there's actually an app from the University of Wisconsin that will rate your cow patty. And so on the left, you'll see relatively smooth outside edges. You'll see, it's about between 2 and 5 centimeters thick. And you can kind of see that it kind of goes in waves across that cow patty. So it's kind of hollow in the middle and kind of ripples on the way out. Whereas the one on the right, you can see that this animal had too much fiber, and it's coming out in clumps. These are the things we have to just pay attention to, so that when we have this rumen operating efficiently, most likely our soils are running optimally too. Really neat way of taking a look at it. So, University of Wisconsin, you want to check them out, and cow patty cow patty research. When we are looking at partnering with someone, when we get into the custom grazing, make sure you have a bit of a chat about making sure that we're on the same page. Set up responsibilities before you get into it, and that may be modified as you go. So if it turns out that uh, you know we're going to do some winter grazing, and in my case, I'm going to be supplying the water, and we have no snow, and I don't have a well. Now we have to figure out, okay, how do we get the water into them? So uh, who's going to be in charge of minerals, who's going to be charged in checking them, if the fence breaks, who does it, all those little things, have it figured out beforehand, so that there's no hard feelings as we get deeper into this. Now that we have a partnership and we have our goals, we have our responsibilities, now we're going to have to design feed for these animals. So this is going to be done the year before. So when we're looking at designing a cover crop, we have to find out, what is our goal? What is our feed goal? We have to decide if we're going to be haying or silage. Are we going to be grazing it? Are we going to be cutting it and then grazing it? Are we going to be swath grazing? Or are we looking at stockpile grazing? So whether it's fall, winter, or spring. When we go through each one of these, our what we need in plants is going to be slightly different. So these are the things that we're going to have that plan of what do we want to do. In some cases, there's some overlap, but we want to make sure that we have that plan in place. When we have these cover crops, what I talk about is using as many of these functional plant groups as possible. So if you listen to Dr. Christine Jones, she talks about the microbe quorum. Some of the things that she has seen and observed is that when we have more functional plant groups, we have different root exudates, and that really multiplies the microbial growth in our soils. So if we are growing barley as our feed source, okay, that's good. We throw some peas in there, boom, we get a little better feed quality. We're doing better for the soil. We throw in some sunflowers, boom, we get that next jump. Throw some Phacelia, boom, we get that next jump. We're adding more and more diversity into our system. Another way of taking a look at it is my two triangles. So our grass, our legume, and then our broadleaves, which I break down to brassica, non-brassica, and forbs. The diversity part where it really kicks in is when we start adding in warm season and cool species of each. When we work with annuals, biennials, and perennials. Now we have lots of species to be working with. This all goes back to, what is your goal? What are you trying to do? How are we going to get there? These are the things we have to think about. Once we have that goal in place, now to go through and create this blend is going to be significantly easier. When we look at grazing, what we want to do when we're picking species is picking plants that regrow after being grazed. We want to have that regrowth. We want to have that green plant growing. In this case, we want to use some late maturing varieties, later maturity. We want to use even some biennials. And whether that biennial overwinters or not, that's going to depend on what your goals are. Or we get into the perennials. We want to keep that plant in that vegetative stage as long as we can. Ideally, we want to use paddock systems so that we can control the grazing, so that once again, you listen to the Alan Savory's management of his grazing, is you want that plant to almost fully recover growth before it gets bit again. When we do that, now we have a full healthy root system that recovers through stress way better than having something that is grazed down like a putting green. And the one of the really interesting things, Jay Fear presented this information from the Medican farms down at Bismarck. And what they did is they took these different species that they had in this cover crop blend, and they cut the plants in half. So what they did is they balanced it on their finger. It's really high tech. And when you can balance a plant on your finger, that balancing point is 50% of the plant is on the top half, 50% is on the bottom half. So easy way to go out in the field and figure out where you should be grazing your plants down to, unless you're dealing with winter grazing, and then it's less critical. But when we start looking at where the plant nutrition is and the quality is, so you look at the annual ryegrass, the top half of the plant, the crude protein is at 15.7%. Relative feed value is at 110, so almost good enough for a beef cow for maintaining, and TDN is at just under 62%. Whereas the bottom half of the plant, you're dealing with 8% protein, 109, so close relative feed value, but your TDN is down by just about 2 points. That top half of the plant is the quality. The bottom half, when we start forcing the cows to clean up that bottom half of the plant, this is where your higher nitrates are, this is where your higher sulfates are, this is where the higher lignin is. Your animal does not do well consuming those. And you go through this list, and really interesting stuff, because when you start looking at uh, sunflowers, you go from 10% crude protein down to 6 on the bottom half, 193 relative feed value down to 123, and 65% TDN down to 58. Significant. Most of those species in there, this is exactly what you see. So that bottom half of the plant, what is it good for? Nature has it designed so that bottom half of the plant is for soil armor. The top half is for the animal, the bottom half is for the soil. So it really, really neat stuff when you start looking at these numbers. So graze half, leave half. When we look at the hay and silage, the regrowth is not as important unless you're planning on doing the grazing after. The regrowth can help with that soil armor part, so that can be important. When we're looking at species, when we're haying, we need that plant to dry down. So using these juicy plants, these brassica plants, I do not recommend using a lot of brassicas in hay. If you're at point like 1% of the plant material is being a brassica, so be it. Anything above that, it's not going to be fun. When we look at silage, yes, you can now include some of these juicier plants, these higher moisture plants, but there's some upper limit to that, because if you have bale silage, if you have bag silage, and you have these brassica plants with high moisture, you put them in there, that bag or that bale is going to freeze. And you can have really good silage until it freezes, and then you have a silage popsicle, which is really tough for the animals to eat. So you want to keep things in perspective. You still want to have a plant in that stand that stays in that vegetative stage, even if you're not grazing. So we're talking 0.5 to 2 plants per square foot. The idea is, once again, to maintain that living vegetative plant with that active growing root. That plant will release up to 80% of the carbon it captures through photosynthesis into the soil to feed that soil biology. When we're dealing with annual plants like oats, barley, wheat, In reality, that soil is only being fed by that plant for up to about 40 days from the root exudates. We need to have that green vegetative plant in our soils for as many days as we can. And what we find is when we start building more microbes in our soil and we have this green living plant, we extend our growing season. We still get the same number of frost free days, but when we have this plant that's green underneath the canopy, what happens is the sugars build up within that plant, and that plant will be able to tolerate more and more frost. So it's built in antifreeze. As it's doing that, it's still capturing sunlight, still feeding that soil. So whether it's grazing or not, one of the keys I think in building soils is having that green vegetative plant. When we look at stockpile forage, and this is whether it's stockpiled for fall grazing, winter grazing, or carried over to next spring, now we need to watch and look for species in this mix that will hold its feed value after it freezes, after it gets snowed on. We need to be able to maintain that feed quality. And then, do we have it standing? Do we put it in a swath? Do we create a bale without tying it? There's different ways of doing this stockpile grazing or stockpile forage. So now the next question is, okay, so if we're going to be going into a stockpile grazing for fall, that's relatively straightforward from the standpoint of we don't have to worry about a lot of uh, uh, losses in our system. But when we start dealing with winter grazing, and we start talking about getting 20, 30, 40, 50 centimeters of snow in this stand, how high of a plant, like what kind of plant architecture do we need in order for that to stand through the snow so that the animals can eat it? The other question is wildlife damage. If we, between whitetail, deer, elk, moose, other critters out there, if we have a real good feed supply, these animals are going to come in and they're going to be in there eating this forage we have earmarked for our livestock. What can we grow in there that those animals, the wildlife, are going to be less picky about? And this is where, if you've ever seen livestock go into and have a choice of bales, what bales do they eat first? Do they eat the stuff that is the reed canary grass and the low relative feed value? They'll eat the highest stuff first. They can sense anything with higher bricks, higher quality, so that's what they're going to go after. This is where some of the producers have gone out and they grow something like millet with the relative feed value that is just adequate for beef, and they have less predation from wildlife. Whereas something like alfalfa bales, that's that relative feed value of 150, that's going to be a big magnet for those animals to come in. So you just have to play around with that a little bit, learn what the animals, what what the local animals are eating and what they need and what they really don't like. Cash crop rotation. So we've grown this cover crop, we've grazed it off, we've hayed it off. Now what do we do? Especially after grazing, the nutrient cycles in that soil that we've grazed, everything speeds up. So our soil nutrition supply levels are quite a bit higher, because when you're looking at a beef cow will urinate about 10 gallons a day. So that's a lot of urine going out. And when you look at what the nutritional value of urine, that is gold, for lack of the bit of a pun there. When we start looking at urine, all those nutrients that are in the urine, when it hits the soil, they are available now to the microbes in the plants. So it's a bit of a rocket fuel for the soil. When you look at the manure part and use some quick numbers, that a cow eats about 2.5% of her body mass. So a 1,200 pound cow is going to eat about 30 pounds of dry matter per day. And she's really good at producing close to that amount of dry matter manure. So not a lot of that fiber stays in that cow. When you start running those numbers, that's a lot of feed that we're putting into the soil or onto the soil that's going to feed the biology that's going to feed that next plant. So we really have to watch if we grow, if we, once again, depending on how many grazing days an acre. So if we have 150 grazing days an acre versus a field that we only have 20 grazing days an acre, that 20 days of grazing, we're going to get a bit of a bump. When we have 150 grazing days an acre, we're going to be able to grow a awesome crop on that with very little inputs. The negative is with all of those nutrients in the soil, now to grow something with weak lodging resistance is going to be a concern because with that soil being so juicy, it's going to produce a lot more vegetative growth, which could be a bad thing if you're going to grow something that's lodgy and get lots of rain that year. With this livestock integration, that soil health, it's improved between adding that manure in the urine, reducing the amount of tillage you're doing, increasing the amount of plant diversity that we're having in a rotation, and ideally having that continuous vegetative plant growing. Those all drive that soil health. But when we are out there and, okay, this is great, we're bringing animals over, some of the things you do not do is do not graze when that soil is saturated, when it's wet. Because when the animals go through, there's a fair amount of pounds per square inch on their hooves when they're walking through, and that will create compaction issues in that soil. So we're going to have to either wait till that soil dries or that soil freezes. Next spring, because you're going to have an active soil, the microbes are going to be doing their things. You're going to start seeing potentially, because your nutrient cycles are speeding up, you're going to start seeing some soil nitrates. If you don't tie them up in the spring, you're going to start seeing a weed flush. So to have something maybe to overwinter, or having a straw pack, that armor that helps to tie up that nitrate. Unless you want to grow weeds, these are the things we have to be thinking about. The other one is try to match your plant supply, so your plant growth, with animal nutritional needs. What I mean by that is going back to those bales that my neighbor did up. So if we're dealing with healthy cow herd, the they're in good shape, we can skimp a little bit on the relative feed value. But if we're dealing with the older cow herd or younger cow herd, where they need a little more protein, when they need a little more energy, now we're going to have to pick the species that are going to match what they need. Are we dealing with something in the first trimester, or are we dealing with something in the third trimester? Because once again, you start putting too much energy into that animal in that last trimester, calving is not going to be very fun. That proper livestock integration, if done properly, builds soil. Improper management will destroy the soil. If you read John Montgomery's or David Montgomery's book, um, "The Soil, the Erosion of Civilizations," wonderful book, highly recommended. And he goes through each of the empires through history, and goes through and describes why they fell apart. And in basically every case that he goes through, these empires collapse because of their soils fell apart. And part of it, if you look at Greece, for example, in Greece, it used to be covered in beautiful forests. Now they have problems growing shrubs because over the centuries they were using sheep and goats, overgrazing, and they destroyed their soil. So they're still in the process of trying to rebuild those. Proper integration of livestock builds soil nutrient levels in the soil. It controls weeds. It manages your crop residues. It has the opportunity to increase your plant diversity. which then increases your microbe diversity in the soil. And it also creates new cash flow opportunities. So if you're strictly a grain producer during the winter, now you have the opportunity to be charging someone to bring animals over to do some grazing on your land. To, and then you get the benefit of those other points above. So it's a really neat way of helping diversify the farm. There's my contact information. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me.